Understanding what inflation is and what causes it is going to be the number one thing that makes you the most money over your investing career. This is the most important thing that I think you need to learn when you start out investing. People always wonder about investing in that. What is investing? Why should they invest? Is it worthwhile? They think about things like fees and what apps should I use. The number one thing that you need to learn is that inflation is what you are trying to beat. Inflation is the central banks creating more of the currency that you currently have. People often think, and they're just confused in that, and they're learning from the wrong resources because maybe the media is trying to tell you that inflation is one thing when it is actually something else. People often think that inflation is caused from companies or companies putting up their prices, things like this. This is not inflation. Inflation is the debasement of the currency that you use. And when I say debasement, it literally just means they are printing more of the currency that you have. They are creating it out of thin air. Who is they? They are the central banks who are in control of the currency that you use, whether you use the US dollar, the euro, the pound. The central banks who are deciding when to increase the supply of currency that you use are the ones that are causing the inflation. And these organizations will try to deflect that this is the reason for deflation. This is the reason for inflation. They will try and say that, look, the cost of things has gone up and the cost of production of individual items that you want to buy has gone up. And this is the reason for inflation. But just remember, at its core, if you want to inflate a currency, the number one way to do it is to create more of that currency. If there is more of the currency that you hold in supply, that means the currency that you hold is worth less. From a core principles point of view, you don't need to get very technical with it. I often see in the media, especially, that inflation gets way overcomplicated when they talk about all the different reasons that they think inflation is caused by. But for example, you have something called the CPI inflation rate, and they tell you the CPI inflation rate is 2.2% and they're trying to get it back to 2%. And when people look at this, they think 2.2%, that's not too bad. That's actually fine. And the 2.2% is actually coming from an organized market basket of goods where if they take a certain time frame over a period of time, the CPI inflation rate tells you that this market basket of goods that you have selected has gone up 2.2% over this period of time. But that's just not the case of what it is actually in reality. And I think the CPI inflation rate, it is promoted so much on so many news channels, media, really a lot of places that talk about inflation will start talking about the CPI inflation rate, because if you start Googling it, you will eventually find someone talking about the CPI. And the problem that I have, and the problem that there is essentially with the CPI inflation rate, is that it can be adjusted to get any kind of inflation rate that the people who are adjusting it want. Why would an inflation rate like this make any sense? If you can create the market basket of goods, that means you can get any inflation rate that you want. And they say that the central banks have a target inflation rate of 2%. That means that they can get any inflation rate they want. And ideally, what they will want is they will just get it so it's just over 2%. That way they can show that they are working and they are taking these measures to try and get it back to 2%. And people will look at the central banks and they'll say, look at them, they're doing a great job, they're working hard. Some people might even have sympathy for them in that the inflation rate is from 2.2% to 2.3%, and they're trying their best to get it back to 2%. And they're doing all these things, and they will show you all these things that they're doing to try and get it back to 2%. But the inflation rate, the CPI inflation rate, is fake. It is not a real inflation rate. The inflation rate is the percentage in a year or whatever, over whatever given time frame you want, the percentage that your currency in supply has been increased by. If the currency that you hold, the total supply has been increased by 10% over 6 months. That means the inflation rate for 6 months is 10%. If the currency that you use has been increased by 25% in supply over a year, that means the inflation rate for that year is 25%. It's not the CPI inflation rate, because you could say that you have, for the CPI, you could say that you have eggs, bread, and milk. And over the course of the last whatever given time frame you want, you could say that these three things have increased on average over a number of suppliers. The price of them has increased by 4%. And then if you take out eggs and you replace it with flour, then you could say that those three things have increased by 2.5%, because the item that you took out as opposed to the item that you put back in, the inflation rate was different for that item. So you can create any inflation rate you want for CPI inflation. If you look into it as to how CPI inflation is actually created, you will eventually find that it is a market basket of goods. And this is so important for you to think about. How can you have an organization who it benefits for the inflation rate to be close to 2% are the same people who actually control what goes into that market basket of goods, and they can change it and swap it around. And if things aren't working, they can just change the rules and set it up so that they get the CPI inflation rate that they want, so people can put that out in the media and actually get the result that they want. So when was the last time that you actually heard of inflation being the increase in supply of your money that you use? People don't talk about that, because people would get concerned. People would be very concerned if they found out that their currency that they're using was increased by 20% in supply in the last year. If you had no other information, that is not a good statistic, because it tells you that your currency has been devalued by 20%. You don't even have to think about money for this. If you have any item and the amount of supply of that item has been increased, the value of that single item that you hold will go down. If it's the same with property, if property in supply goes up a lot, the value of the property that is there will go down because there is more available. Supply and demand is something that has been there since the beginning of time. If there is more supply, the value of the individual items will go down. And it's a thing with fiat currency that you have, where €1 or $1 will always be measured as €1 or $1. They won't tell you that the euro that you had a few years ago is now worth a lot less. But we actually know this ourselves, that it's worth a lot less, but people just don't think about it because they say one is one. Maybe you need more of those now to buy the same things that you were able to buy for less before, but it's still just called €1 or $1. It's not called 6/10 of the euro that you had 2 years ago. That's not the case. So if there was actually a more clear measurement of the currency that you use being published and easily accessed, then people would have a better understanding of what's happening with inflation. And I think all of this CPI inflation and all the other inflation metrics that are given out to the media and published in all sorts of different ways should be just ignored, because the inflation rate for a year is the percentage increase in the supply of that money for that year. That's it. But they don't put that out because people would get too concerned, and they would probably protest against the system. And people don't want people to protest against the system. They just want everyone to believe the CPI inflation rate is 2 or 2.2%, and they're trying to get it back to 2. And 2 doesn't sound too bad. But if they told you it was 25%, you would say, so my money that I hold is worth 25% less than it was a year ago or something. That would be absolutely disastrous, because obviously people would go crazy about that, because it's the same if you saw something like taxes and they said, okay, the tax last year was 2%, but now it's actually 25%. People would go crazy at that metric and that statistic, and they would fight to change the system. And with fiat currency, the central banks are in control and they can print as much money as they want. And they don't want people to fight against that system, because being able to create more of the currency supply is really the best thing they have at the central banks. It's the best thing that they have, because they have control of the entire system. I think some people would agree with me. Maybe some people may not agree with me, but you can put a comment below the video if you want, if you think you have another idea of what's causing it, or what is going on with the system. Make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. I appreciate it. See you in the next one.